Network to the world. Subscribe now to the Hot 97 YouTube channel. It's Ebro in the Morning with Laura Stiles and Rosenberg.
Ebro, Laura, and Rosenberg back on the show. Friend of the show, public advocate Jumaane Williams. Good morning, sir.
Morning, peace and blessing, love and light to everybody.
Yo, listen, man. We was just talking about it off the air, but do you want to, once again, for the audience, detail what the hell you doing on IG Live trying to get the grays out your bed? What's going on, man?
Yo, so I had my barber told me like 2-3 years ago a specific joint to use if you want to put your joint, make your joint black. I didn't do it for like 3 years. I went back and forth. I said I'd never do it. Then I was getting married. My wife told me not to do it, but I said I want to take out some of it. But I didn't want anybody to think I was trying to fake the funk. So I just said, let me go on the Gram Live.
All right, so you wanted to be transparent.
Yo, man, you don't owe it. Listen, I know you're the public advocate. All right. You do a lot in public and for the public. But you ain't got to do everything in public.
You mean, Ebro, he doesn't have to feel guilty about darkening his beard.
But I got to tell you, right. I was shocked at how many people were invested to make sure that this happened. Like 2 days and 2 nights in a row, we had mad people watching to see if it happened or not. It was hilarious. I kept a little bit. I might take it out next time. The worst part was my stepdaughter didn't tell me I had these shorts on that was all the way up, and I didn't see it until I posted it. Like nobody told me I was, looking a little crazy.
You were showing a lot of thigh on the gram.
No, it was wild, man. Like, why would you hold a phone like that and not say?
I'm surprised New York Post didn't grab the photo and say public advocate thotting on the gram.
The pom shorts on, yo. It was crazy, man. It was crazy, yo. It rolled up. Just so the next night I clarified though that the shorts was normal. They just rolled up a little bit. That's all.
So let's jump into work, man. We did the ranked choice voting. There was some problems, as we knew there would be. There's an investigation going on right now to make sure that ranked choice voting actually benefited the people as it was intended. We knew that there would definitely be some issues with older voters and people who just didn't get it. What do you know? Where's this going? Have you seen any analytics or analysis on how ranked choice voting worked or did not work?
So I am a proponent of ranked choice voting, have been before, and I am now. And there was a lot of hysteria around it that just didn't pan out. Now, there were some errors within the Board of Elections. That happens with the Board of Elections. The problem is the Board of Elections. And there was a lot of great men and women that did a good job on election day. The Board of Elections itself is rife with problems. So that issue that happened, they actually forgot to take out a bunch of dummy ballots when they were testing the system. That could have happened with or without ranked choice voting, that human error. And we've been talking about that for a very long time. What we did see on election night was that the vast majority of people who won on election night before the ranked voting was counted actually won when the ranked was voted, when the ranked choice was counted. We saw some small changes in places that actually helped diversify when we saw Black women in particular and Latina women who were given a leg up at the end of the ranked choice voting. That happened in about 3 places. But by and large, it operated the way we said it would operate. And 90% of the people who went through it on exit interviews had no problem. I agree, we didn't do enough education and we have to do more. But I would say we have to do that anyway within the Board of Elections system. People vote regularly for multiple judges in a section where you vote for judges and have no idea who the judges are, who they're voting for, or what it means. And so to focus just on ranked choice voting, I think is misguided when people who just didn't support it for various reasons are pretending that somehow it's harmful to segments of the community.
So you think that it was considering it was our first run at it, it was done well.
I mean, the Board of Elections had a problem, man. Despite
the issues that need to be fixed, the overarching outcome,
I think it did what it was supposed to do. I think it helped diversify people who get elected. I think it saved us money and will in the future when it came to not having to have runoff elections or people brought into court because the election margins were too small. We saw some of that, but we didn't see as much of it as we might have. And it also strengthens the vote. What we found when people are actually asked is that they like the fact that they don't have to just choose one person at one time. They can rank who it is that they want. and keeping in mind that if your person gets over the threshold of 50%, there's no more ranked voting. And so people were under the impression that they should only rank their favorite person instead of exhausting their ballot. Now that was harmful. And so we kept trying to tell folks that the best thing to do is to tell people to exhaust their ballots. But instead of actually, doing the work to understand that that's the best thing, there were some folks who were giving misinformation. Now, again, we should have done more education. I think that's harmful. I think the government failed in not doing that, and we have to push forth in that. But we have to do that regardless of the system that's there. And I do think ranked choice voting is a better system than the system we have.
Jumaane, you are currently back on the ballot running for public advocate, because I know in the primary, you weren't on the ballot, right? Like you didn't have to do a primary, right?
I absolutely was on the ballot, and thankfully, a lot of folks found my name, and I'm very appreciative of that. But I was in the primary. A lot of folks didn't realize that until they got there.
Well, I assumed you weren't because we didn't hear from you.
Oh no! So we had a race that we took seriously.
I was upset. I was mad.
At the same time, we felt we would probably do okay. So we did what we had to do to make sure that our name was out there where it needed to be. We did have 2 people who were on the ballot, but no one got public financing, so it didn't raise and elevate to the level of some of the other races. Thanks to the folks in New York, we got 70% of the vote anywhere, and I'm very humbled and honored by that.
So now it looks as if Eric Adams will be the next mayor of New York City.
Here we go.
Where do you guys agree on things, and where do you guys disagree on things today?
So it was no secret. I endorsed Amaya Wiley as my first. I'm one of the few people who actually put out the 5 people I was going to be voting for in ranked choice because I believed in it and wanted to do it by example. I did the rest by alphabetical order. And to the surprise of some people, not to the surprise of folks who actually know me, Eric was on that list for several reasons. I've worked with him on a lot of issues. One of them includes gun violence, and he's been very good on this issue in ways that others have not. When the call was put out this past year to really push the envelope on what the city was doing during the pandemic, there were many electeds who shied away from that. He wasn't one of them. And so there was some concern, and still have some concern, about many of the things that I heard on the campaign trail that just, I think stretched too far in a direction that they can be harmful, particularly around some conversations that involve policing. My hope is that Eric Adams, that I worked on with gun violence, that I worked on during the pandemic, is the one that shows up to govern. The things I've heard so far with his meetings with Biden and things of that nature give me some encouragement. So I'm hoping that the things that we agreed on are the things that we focus on. Of course, there's issues, but I got to say there was issues with most of the folks that were running, right? So he wasn't the only one that people took some exception to. And on the campaign trail, sadly, there are a lot of things that go back and forth. My hope is that the stuff that we disagree on when it comes to some of the things that were said around policing are not the direction that we're going.
In other words, stop and frisk. You're not trying to bring back stop and frisk, Monty.
So I would say it was a confluence of statements that were made. And honestly, even with the stop and frisk comments, if you take it out by itself, he was actually saying the correct thing. So I've always said that, stop, question, and frisk, no matter how you look at it, is a tactic that police have to be able to use to do their job. What's happened too often was turned into a crime-fighting strategy. And that was turned into numbers where people had to not stop people for reasonable suspicion, but because they needed a number. That can never come back. And we should never try to bring that back. But the issues of whether a police officer should be able to do a constitutional stop was never in question, even for the people who are most ardently out there fighting it. And so I think people took the ability to kind of misconstrue some of those things. But that
I don't think the layman like myself knows the difference.
That's correct. I think that's correct.
You know what I'm saying? So when you use certain words, yes, we will, be traumatized when you start using words like stop and frisk. So there needs to be other terminology to speak to what the intent actually is. And my biggest problem always remains, which is oversight and the NYPD being able to govern itself and us acting as if there's a culture there where they can get to a point of actually being able to make sure they don't become abusive with their tactics.
I think all of that is correct. And when you start talking about, abusive style question Frisk, you start talking about, plainclothes units and things of that nature, it does bring a lot of cause for concern. Where I was on this issue even a decade ago, really focused on trying to reform the NYPD. Where I'm at now is different. Now, understanding that we have to have transparency and accountability within the NYPD. But to some of the things that you're talking about, there's no reform in the world that's going to help us if we do not take the fundamental step of understanding that public safety can no longer be in the realm of law enforcement, and that NYPD cannot be responsible for all of the things that we've underfunded in these communities. And that's a fundamental shift that we have to make. And I think we're starting to make it, but it takes courage and it takes action and it takes us using the funds in a better way. And my hope is that we can continue with that discussion, because I think that's the most important discussion. That's the discussion that we missed in the budget talks in the past 2 years. That's a discussion that we failed to deliver after the protests last year.
Well, let's unpack that briefly, Jumaane, because, glossing over that when you say things like, use the funds differently, right? The term, the phrase defund the police has become a polarizing phrase, right? When most people who know what it means are basically saying we need to use the money, some of the funds that are going to police for public safety and public health issues need to be going to more specialized organizations, right? That can be more hands-on and more careful when dealing with mental health issues, some of the poverty issues and things like that, correct?
So I think that's a great description of what's happening. What I found is that there are people who thrive off division. And so there are people who kind of push this division instead of actually beginning to figure out what people mean when they're saying defund the police. People go up in arms on it. And what I've continually said is my job as an elected official, our jobs as legislators, is not to tell people how to define the trauma that they're experiencing in the streets. Our job is to take their trauma and turn it into actual policy. And so I'm always bewildered by the people who are focusing on this phrase as if this phrase is the problem. No, the problem is what people are talking about. And when you actually have a leader who will have the discussion, they will find more commonality. There are police officers who will tell you they don't want to be going on all of the calls that they're going on. It's demoralizing to them. There are people who understand that we have to fund the things that you just spoke about. Well, if we have to do that and we have a limited amount of funds, then what are we going to do? And so instead of giving $200 million more to the NYPD to run youth programs, maybe you should give that money to the Department of
people who run youth programs.
So, I mean, and if you want to say that you should, and everybody agrees that we should not be having police be the first people responding to mental health crisis, well, we have to fund the people who have to respond to those. And so when you talk about a budget of $6 to $11 billion, it's a lot of money. And so we just have to figure out how best to spend those funds. And it's important to make the connection about what we deem as public safety and what we actually fund. And then that's when the rubber meets the road, that's where we have the conversations. And the people who don't really want to have that conversation will focus on words like defund as if that's the problem. The problem is the trauma that's been inflicted into these communities for far too long. And what I've never heard is someone say we should defund public safety. I've never heard that. And everybody wants to be safe. We made errors 30 years ago when there was the same kind of spike in violent crime. People apologized 30 years later for that. We don't need to wait 30 years now to apologize again. We can get it right now. And what we have to do is not feed the fear. But we also have to do a better job on the folks I hang out with on the left, because sometimes they're afraid to grab a conversation around gun violence. And we cannot ignore that. We cannot ignore people getting shot in the street and act like that's something that we're just going to let go. And so I want to push even the folks that I hang out with all the time and who believe the things I believe. We have to do better at grabbing that conversation, because we actually have policies that will make people safer. And you have to remember, folks want to be safe and they want to feel safe. Sometimes folks are safe but don't feel safe, and that could be just as dangerous in pushing policies that harm people.
In what ways are people afraid to talk about gun violence? Like in New York City right now, violence is up, right? Illegal guns on the street. We know that the illegal guns are traveling here oftentimes from places where there's gun loopholes and other states, right? Whether that's the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida, even Virginia. But what conversations and what do we need to do to dig in on this gun violence issue?
This is the first time, and I'm so happy to see it. It feels like city, state, and federal government are aligning to start discussing gun violence in a real way, and gun violence that affects Black and brown people. Because usually when people are talking about it, talking about mass shootings, and they're talking about high magazines and automatic weapons, machine guns, which we have to focus on. But the handgun violence has been a huge problem in our communities. And for far too long, there has been silence. And sometimes, not all the time, but people who really elevate some of these other discussions will begin to grow silent when it comes to gun violence. And we can't. The quote unquote progressive, whatever that means, because everybody says they're progressive now, including the governor. But whatever that means, or on the left, we have to grab this conversation and can't be afraid of talking about violence and talking about crime in these communities. Because as I mentioned, we have the solutions to them. One, we have to separate it out, right? We have the supply and we have the demand. As you discussed, there's a supply of guns coming in. Our federal government has to do a much better job really dealing with the iron pipeline coming into these communities. The demand side, local governments and state governments have an awesome ability to fund programs that are evidence-based to address the root causes of these problems. We've seen them work. We were told that it would never work, but up until 2019, the things that I've been leading on and pushing on that we got some minimal funding on showed results. We were the safest city we'd ever been in the history of New York City. Now, data means nothing to anyone who's a victim of crime. So I always want to be clear about that. If you're a victim of crime, data means nothing to you. But at the same time, when we look at it, 2018, 2019, we were almost at unsustainable lows of gun violence and murders, and still proponents who want to just lock up as many Black and brown people as they can were saying we're going out of control. We have to continue to push more of these oppressive policing policies. The difference between 2019 and 2021 is 2020. We had a global pandemic. We had protests all throughout this nation. Everyone like me who focuses on these issues was saying these things will probably get worse. We should plan for them. You can't think that homelessness will get worse, mental health crisis would get worse, food insecurity get worse, and things like violence would not. And we didn't focus on it. And what's happening now was expected, and it's not just New York City. People try to blame New York State bail reform. It's happening all over
everywhere.
The nation.
Every major city, everywhere.
That's correct. And so we have the capability to really do this in the right way. And, you know, I see folks like the governor who are finally talking the language that many of us have been pushing for years, finally saying they're going to put some funding into issues. There was a program that got some additional seed funding from the mayor, which is great, but they're getting the money starting July 1st. So we're planning for next summer. What's going to happen this summer? And so, you know, it takes a lot of courage to have this conversation. I think we're starting to go in the right direction. But what we can't do is let people who want to use division to prevent us from addressing the issues that we know are at hand in a real way. And there are real solutions to this. And of course, none of this excuses you for shooting up the block. It just does not. And there has to be accountability for that. And we know that law enforcement is a part of the public safety discussion. The problem has been we have used them primarily as the only part of discussion. And the structural changes, the other part is structural changes that have to be done. I called Mayor Ross Baraka in New Jersey. You may or may not know this. In Newark, last year, they were one of maybe 2 or 3 cities that did not have a spike in gun violence. They had no police shootings. I think they've had one this year. They had no issues with their protests. And I called the brother, like, what happened? How did y'all make it work? He told me, yo, we doing what you're doing over in New York City. I'm like, what is the difference? When I went over to Newark, the primary difference was there was a mayor who was bought into looking at public safety differently. There was a police commissioner that was bought in to looking at this differently. There was a public safety director that the police commissioner reports to that look at this differently. They hire a certain amount of police officers, they hire a social worker. The thing we've been pushing here is why a police department the only one looking at CompStat crime numbers? Everybody should be looking at that. In Newark, New Jersey, everybody's looking at the same numbers so they can work on it. When I said we have a great office of mayor office of gun violence prevention, which is great, but in Newark, New Jersey, everybody's sitting at the adults table. And sometimes I feel like people are not all sitting at the big table. They're like, over there, that's cute. But we have to have fundamental structural change in a way that we haven't seen and we know actually works.
Jumaane Williams, so who's the Republican running for public advocate? Does that even exist? Like,
yes, there is a South Asian woman doctor. I don't recall her name, and I apologize. She's running a Republican line, and we have a conservative opponent who actually ran in the primary as well. So we have two people who are going to be running against us.
There it is.
Jumaane, you had I saw something interesting that you launched a special campaign to raise awareness about Black maternal health. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
There are, when we talk about public health, I think there's a lot of issues that cross section of that, and there's no secret that people who did not have access to health before the pandemic were the people who were hit the hardest. And one of those things we're speaking about is Black maternal health. 4, 6, 7, I've seen up to 8 times Black mothers are more likely to die in childbirth than other races. That's a problem. So we have several bills that we're introducing into the city council to help people understand what their rights actually are. We're supporting the Omnibus bill in the federal government that will help provide funding and information to these communities. You'd be surprised. My wife, who we were speaking about earlier, I have an awesome stepdaughter, but she was offered only and given a cesarean section as the only option that she had when she had her child back then, not even knowing that she had the ability to say no to that. And most Black women, unfortunately, if you talk to them, that's the first thing that people want to go to. And those are the lucky ones, because there are many that don't survive, and we have to raise that as an issue. We have to push that cross section of health. We have to push the cross section of education and how we look at public safety. There's another thing that we're working on when it comes to technology, and how technology and facial recognition follows the same, unfortunately, bias-based problems that we see. And we're working on all of these things and raising all of these alarms from the public advocate's office, and hoping we win the general election so we can continue that fight.
Jumaane Williams, we vote again in November, correct?
Yes, that is correct. On November, we're going to have the general election, so we want folks to come back out one more time. And we're going to have the one we just had was a primary. This is going to be the general with all the parties, Republican, Conservative, Democrat. Let me see, Devi Nampiaparamepal. That is the Republican opponent. I didn't want to disrespect her by not saying her name correctly.
Well, look, Jumaane, the next time there's an election and we don't hear from you, you see on this show, we're like, Jumaane must not be running, because we ain't hear from him. So
my bad. I appreciate what I appreciate is all your listeners came out and voted anyway. So
what Jumaane doesn't want to do, what Jumaane doesn't want to do is say to you, Ebro, listen, yes, he had an election, but he wasn't stressing it because he knew he was good. He's not going to disrespect his opponents, but he also didn't want to overuse the favor. He wanted to wait for the general.
I get it.
You know what I'm saying? So let him live, man.
All right. He's our public advocate. We love him, Jumaane. Thank you for all your work throughout the years and work, man. Thank you so much
for raising these real issues to the hip hop community. Sometimes they don't know the strength they have to really affect these issues. So I appreciate you.
Well, and also before we go, speaking of issues right now, vaccines. Right. I mean, New York State is doing relatively good in the uptick, right? Like when you look around the nation of, and I think most people around here are, if they're vaccine hesitant or vaccinated already, I think most people are on the page, right? There's a few people who aren't even on our show. But Jumaane, before you depart, what do you want to say to people about the vaccine?
So we are, as you mentioned, doing much better than some places in the nation. There are still pockets here that are problematic. We're starting to do better in the Black and brown community. We have to do even better there. We've seen pockets of conservative New York City that are not getting their vaccinations. And that causes problems because it helps other variants mutate. And so people keep thinking, oh, we don't have to worry because it's only unvaccinated. But it helps people, it helps the variant, the virus continue to mutate. That's harmful. There are people who can't get vaccinated, even if they want to, that is being harmful too. And so we want to continue to encourage everybody to get the vaccination. But also, there are things that we can do that are less strict than some of the lockdown things that we've seen. And wearing your mask indoors is one of them. It's simple. People pretending that somehow it's putting handcuffs on folks. Just wear your mask indoors. Those two things combined can really prevent the worst of what we're seeing, because we're seeing now a uptick on the Delta variant. And whereas the virus before took about 15 minutes for you to be in the presence to get it, the Delta variant you can get within seconds. And so and if you're vaccinated, by the way, unfortunately, you can actually have it and pass it, even though you have no symptoms. And so we all have to work on this together.
There it goes. Mask up, be safe, take precautions. Jumaane Williams, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Jumaane.
Thanks, Jumaane.
Peace.